So in this video, we are talking about why divorce happens. Well, at least in my opinion. Now, my name is Marcus. This is Discover Ignite, where we discover possibilities and ignite change. Now, today I want to essentially talk about this, right? I've been through 2 divorces, and I want to really nail down why I believe it happens. Now, going into any marriage, right, you always have good intentions. You don't essentially marry someone to essentially not live that happily ever after ending, right? Now, that's the first, I think, real big roadblock we all kind of steer away from, right? And we assume that that's the way life's supposed to be, right? Now, this is something I think at a young age we all kind of fall into, in the belief that that's what it's supposed to be like. And then you get into your marriage, and up until that point life was good, right? You guys went through challenges, everything was good. You assume that life would be great, right? That happily ever after. But we all tend to forget that there is a honeymoon stage, right? It doesn't matter how long you've been dating. I think subconsciously we kind of fall into this thing, well, now we're married, so I feel like you're locked in, right? Like forever after. And sometimes I think just that concept, that idea that you're locked in with someone forever kind of plays a toll on your subconscious, right? Because a lot of times you have these goals, these ideas in your life about, okay, well, I'm gonna get that successful career, I'm going to get that nice house, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, right? Some of us may want to go to college, and then, I want to be married, I want to have kids, I want to have a dog, I want to have all these different things, right? And so you go into the marriage thinking of these things, and then you start, knocking out these things, right? You start checking things off your list. And then a lot of times when you don't find the next goal or the next thing that you want to do, right, you start getting into this mindset in which you start nitpicking a lot of different things. And I've fallen into this, right, to where you start nitpicking a bunch of different things about the other person because perhaps you haven't set that next goal or that next thing, right? We lose ourselves, right, in going into a marriage. And a lot of times we tend to blame that other person when in fact I don't believe it's the other person. I think it's the idea that we lose ourselves. And going into any marriage, I think you should always make that a priority, right? Is to understand that, hey, this is who I want to be, this is who I'm going to be, this is what I want to accomplish in life. And the other person should want to do that with you, right? The other person should have their own goals and objectives. And a lot of times if we don't do that, we tend to find out that, hey, we start kind of nitpicking at each other, and the next thing you know, you're getting to these massive fights with your significant other for no apparent reason, right? And then you start nitpicking about the smallest little things, right? Or perhaps about not wiping the counter off or something, when it may have just been that one time, right? That one time you didn't do it, the other person got mad about it, and then they say you do it all the time. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, right? Now you're just breaking stuff down into small details. But ultimately, I think it's just that sense, right? That sense that we forget who we are. And then we start blaming that other person from taking away all those other things, when in fact it's ourselves, right? That's tend to not set any more goals in our lives, right? We essentially had that list and it's been accomplished, but we don't replace it with anything else, right? We do grow. And in growing, this is one thing to also keep in mind, in growing, that doesn't mean you guys have to grow apart. And if you do grow apart, right, maybe you guys don't see eye to eye on some things, and maybe it is time for a divorce. But nonetheless, I think, if it comes to that stage where you are getting a divorce, it is what it is. As long as you're trying to put forth the effort to, try to keep it together, try to understand where you're all coming from. But I think it's ultimately important to make sure that you have your own independent, thoughts and ideas, right? And that the fact that the other person essentially helps you with those thoughts and ideas and helps you try to strive to be a better person. And if that can't be accomplished, then yes, divorce obviously happens. And I think a lot of times we feel like that person we blame everything on that person for whatever reason, right? But we're looking for an out essentially because we are miserable, and so we'll blame that other person. Now, I'm a big believer in taking responsibility for yourself, and if you can't take responsibility, no matter how much you think it may be the other person that was solely responsible for what has occurred, right? I do believe that, right, if you've cheated or something like that, yes, there's good reasoning behind that. But if it's not, right, if it's just a breakdown in communication, right, there might be a reason for that breakdown in communication, because perhaps you had these thoughts and ideas, and perhaps you've presented them to the other person, and the other person doesn't really see it that way, right? Maybe your beliefs have changed, right? And at that point, I think it could be really hard. When your beliefs have changed in life, then right, the other person may not see that same way, and perhaps you try to guide them and they just won't budge, right? And then it will lead to divorce, right? And this is where growth can be detrimental to the relationship. But ultimately, going into any relationship, you got to have good intentions. You got to realize that communication is a huge thing, right? And when the communication breaks down, there goes the marriage, right? Ultimately, that's what it is the communication. But again, it also depends on the other person, right? If you guys aren't talking and realizing that, hey, I'm trying to grow, I want to grow, can you grow with me? And you realize when you can't grow together anymore, that is when I believe a divorce is essentially inevitable, right? If you aren't putting forth the effort, or you're essentially half-assing it, right? Because a lot of times you could be half-assing the relationship, but your thoughts and ideas are over here on how you want to grow. The other person is like, yeah, that's not going to happen, or maybe they're very negative about everything, and you're like, okay, well, that's not really helping me, right? I'm trying to make this work, but because of the fact that you are being negative and not seeing the positivity over here, then a lot of times that leads to divorce, right? There's a lot of times where you'll think that the divorce is ultimately where it's at, right? You'll think life is so much better on the other side, and it's something you really have to analyze, right? It's something that you have to realize that life isn't always greener on the other side, right? This is not saying that if you are a miserable person in that situation, in that relationship, maybe it's gotten to the point to where it is completely 110% miserable, then yes, a divorce should happen. I believe a divorce isn't something that is frowned upon as it once was, right? And so in thinking this way, right, and having this mindset about going into divorce and why a divorce would possibly happen, it's ultimately going in with the intention that this person is supposed to make me happy. This person is supposed to provide everything for me, right? If you have that intention going into a marriage, I think you are setting yourself up first and foremost. And then when expectations aren't met, especially when you're not relaying expectations, I think expectations are something that need to be essentially put forth before a marriage is even begun, right? And when that stuff is not there, right, a lot of times you'll have expectations, and the people won't be meeting those expectations because people don't know what your expectations are. And if you aren't consistently telling that person, well, hey, I'm expecting you to do this, but you don't do this, or perhaps, I've changed my thoughts, my beliefs, my ideas of things I want to do in life, right? I had that list and it's been completed. Now I want to shift attention to something else. And if you aren't relaying that to the other person, their expectations might change of you, right? And so that's something that's important. That's extremely important to realize why a divorce might actually happen, because then you feel constrained, and then you feel like, I'm just so miserable, I can't be with this person. And a lot of times, people will stay in a marriage, in a loveless marriage, for reasons that may not make any sense, right? Like, how much are you going to essentially put your life on hold? Right now, some people will push through it, and they say that you'll get to the other side where life is better. Now, that may be true. I've been married for several number of years, and I've been with someone for long durations of time, and I can tell you that people do change, right? There are, I think, traits about people that will never change, right? And then there's other beliefs and thoughts that can change, but you can only wait for so long before someone will get fed up, and then the other person will perhaps move on. But ultimately, to the point of why a divorce may occur, it's ultimately a combination of things, right? It's a combination of losing ourselves and then essentially nitpicking that other person, right? And realizing that we will essentially cast all blame on the other person for what is essentially occurred, when in fact, we need to take responsibility for ourselves and the actions that we've taken, because perhaps we've shut ourselves off because of certain events that may have occurred and our, again, expectations aren't met. And so we'll shut ourselves off, which leads to essentially this cascading effect that will eventually lead to divorce. And so that's why communication is such a huge thing, and why a lot of essential marriages lead to divorce, because there's a breakdown in that communication. And if you can't pull that communication back together, if you can't find it in yourselves to be able to build it back up, then I think a lot of times divorce is essentially inevitable, right? Because communication is such key. And if you can't do that, then it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to rebuild. And you're essentially just going through motions at that point and living your own separate lives. And that's essentially not why you got married, right? Ultimately, you get married to, in my mind, right? This is my thoughts, my beliefs. You get married to essentially help each other grow. Right now, sometimes you grow apart, sometimes you don't, and finding that one person that will do that, I think, is a journey in itself, right? This is why I think you should, spend a lot more time dating before actually going into any kind of marriage, and essentially giving yourself 110% for that person, right? And be wanting to do that, and realizing the fact that, hey, that person is not out there to make me happy, right? That is my responsibility, is to make myself happy. My responsibility is to go after those things to continue growth, my growth, right? And that other person should want the same kind of growth. And if we both have that desire to want to grow, and the desire and the understanding that, hey, trust, right? That I trust the other person, the fact that we will grow stronger together, we will grow, we will help each other become better people, right? And that's ultimately what it is, that I'm not relying on that person for my happiness, I'm not relying on that person with certain expectations, right? Especially when you're not relaying those expectations, but to have that expectation of somebody, right? It's just trusting that person, I think, ultimately, and not worrying about what they're doing, right? They have their own independent lives. And I think that's ultimately what's going to make a sound foundation for any relationship, is to have your own goals and desires and be able to share with that person, and that person be genuinely excited about that. And when you don't see that, it can really deter a lot of different things, but again, it can lead up from a bunch of other things that have happened, and we tend to neglect and find out later on that, hey, I could have improved a lot of different things, but it happens. And that's ultimately what leads to divorce, is the fact that we neglect, because at some point we check out because we believe it's just 110% the other person's problem, right? And again, we tend to forget that we are in control of our lives, in control of our happiness, and that is no other body's responsibility. So if you guys enjoyed this video, remember to hit the like button on the way out. Until next time, I will see you guys later.